Hello, I'm Bill from Great American Classics. Today we're going to talk about something called the Helicopter War in Vietnam, the men who flew into hell. I found this story fascinating and thought you might. As always, we want to thank all of the men and women for their ultimate sacrifice to make this country what it is. Without them, I wouldn't be here today. In truth, that would probably go for a lot of us, right? Anyway, you come for the story, so let me quit blabbering about. Vietnam was the first true helicopter war, a conflict where young Americans climbed into machines that were barely a generation old and flew them into places that seemed designed to kill them. They flew low, they flew slow, and they flew into enemy fire day after day because that was the job and because their brothers on the ground needed them. This is a story about real people, real sacrifice, and a moment in history that still matters. So let's take a look back and try to understand what they went through and why it mattered so much. To really understand the helicopter war in Vietnam, you have to understand that when it started, nobody really knew what they were doing. The helicopter was still a relatively new technology. The first practical helicopters had only been developed during World War II, and they hadn't been used much in combat. Korea saw some helicopter operations, mostly medical evacuations and a few transport missions, but nothing like what was about to happen in Vietnam. The French had used helicopters in Indochina in the early 1950s, learning some hard lessons about what worked and what didn't. But when the Americans arrived in force in the early 1960s, they were essentially writing the book on helicopter warfare as they went along. The landscape of Vietnam made helicopters essential in a way they had never been before. The country was covered with dense jungle, rugged mountains, and terrain that made conventional ground movement incredibly difficult. There were few roads, and the roads that existed were often mined or ambushed. Moving troops and supplies by ground was slow, dangerous, and frequently impossible. But a helicopter could fly over all of that. It could land in a small clearing in the jungle, drop off troops or supplies, pick up wounded men, and be gone before the enemy could react. At least, that was the theory. The reality turned out to be much more complicated and much more deadly. The Marines were among the first to deploy helicopters in Vietnam in significant numbers. In April 1962, a unit called Marine Medium Helicopter Squadron 362, or HMM 362, arrived at Soc Trang in the Mekong Delta as part of something called Operation Shoofly. They brought with them the Sikorsky H-34, which the Marines called the Seahorse and the Army called the Choctaw. It was a big, bulky helicopter with a radial piston engine, the same kind of engine that had powered World War II bombers like the B-17. The H-34 could carry about 12 to 16 combat-equipped troops, and it was tough and reliable, but it was also slow and vulnerable. The engine was mounted in the nose, which meant the pilots sat up high, almost on top of the aircraft, and the troops sat in a cabin below and behind them. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And for the early years of the war, it was the Marine Corps' primary assault helicopter. One young Marine who found himself working on these helicopters was a kid named Jim White. He had joined the Marine Corps in the summer of 1960 under circumstances that were, to put it mildly, unconventional. White had been a spoiled rich kid from Connecticut, driving a Jaguar and attending college when he got into an argument with his father over wanting a newer car. In a fit of youthful rebellion, he drove up to Boston and tried to join the military. The Air Force rejected him because of his medical history. The Navy rejected him. The Army rejected him. He had had infantile paralysis as a child. He had been born with a cleft palate, and he had been hospitalized after being bitten by venomous snakes he had been collecting as a hobby. He was classified 4F, physically unfit for service, by every branch he approached. But the Marine Corps recruiter was behind on his quota, and he looked at this skinny kid with bad acne and apparently decided that if he was vertical and breathing, he would do. The recruiter told White not to check certain boxes on his medical form and sent him to a different physical examination site where nobody knew him. White passed, and a few days later, he was on a train to Parris Island, South Carolina, to become a Marine. His parents, who had considerable political connections in Connecticut, actually showed up at boot camp and tried to get him out, but White refused to leave. He had found something in the Marine Corps that he had never had before, a sense of purpose, discipline, and camaraderie. He served his first enlistment as an infantry machine gunner with the 5th Marines, and when it came time to re-enlist, he requested aviation. He wanted to fly. The Marine Corps had other ideas. Because White had a first-class FCC radio license from his hobby days, they made him an aviation electronics technician, what the Marines called a twidget. He hated it. He wanted to be on the flight line, working on the aircraft, not sitting in an air-conditioned box repairing radios. So he started volunteering for extra duty, working the night shift with the mechanics, learning everything he could about the helicopters themselves. He was persistent and stubborn, and eventually the maintenance officer noticed. After proving himself on deployments to the Mediterranean and Norway, White was given something almost unheard of, a secondary military occupational specialty as a helicopter mechanic, earned entirely through on-the-job training. Then, he was given his own aircraft as crew chief. He was finally where he wanted to be. By 1966, White had transferred to HMM 262, a squadron known as the Flying Tigers. The unit had a rich history, stretching back to World War II, though not connected to the famous American volunteer group in China that shared the nickname. Marine HMM 262 had arrived in Vietnam in December 1966, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Ural W. Bill Shadrick, and they were flying a new aircraft, the Boeing Vertol CH-46 Sea Knight. The Sea Knight was a tandem rotor helicopter, meaning it had 2 rotors instead of 1, which gave it more lift and stability. The crews called it the Frog because of its frog-like appearance, and it could carry about 17 combat-equipped troops, plus a crew of 4 or 5. It was a significant improvement over the H-34, faster and more capable, though early models had some dangerous problems with the tail pylon that caused several crashes before engineers figured out the fix. White became the crew chief on the commanding officer's aircraft, a position of considerable responsibility and trust. As crew chief, he was responsible for the maintenance and readiness of the helicopter, and he flew every mission as part of the crew, manning one of the door guns and watching over the aircraft in flight. It was during this period that one of the defining moments of his life occurred. In early 1966, before the squadron deployed to Vietnam, White's helicopter was sent to insert a Marine reconnaissance team in mountainous terrain. The mission went wrong almost immediately. As the helicopter approached the landing zone, an enemy machine gun nest opened fire. The aircraft was raked with bullets, over 50 hits in a matter of seconds. Everyone on board was wounded except White. The pilots were hit, the other crew members were hit, 6 reconnaissance Marines in the back were hit, one of them fatally shot between the eyes. A bullet had also severed the fuel line to one of the engines, and jet fuel was spraying throughout the cabin. White moved through the chaos, found the severed fuel line and held it together with his hands and then with a scarf tied around it. This improvised repair allowed enough fuel to reach the engine that the pilot, Major Greg Corliss, despite being wounded in the arm, was able to nurse the crippled helicopter out of the kill zone and crash land at a small South Vietnamese outpost miles away. White stayed with the wrecked aircraft overnight to prevent the South Vietnamese from stripping it, then helped prepare it for recovery. For his actions that day, White was later awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest decorations for valor in aerial combat. The ceremony was held aboard a ship off the coast of Vietnam, with Lieutenant General Victor Brute Krulak presenting the medal. Krulak was a legendary Marine, a three-star general who had done more than almost anyone to develop helicopter warfare tactics. He was about 5'4", and the nickname Brute had been given ironically by his Naval Academy classmates. But there was nothing small about his reputation or his influence. His son, Charles Krulak, would eventually become Commandant of the Marine Corps. During the award ceremony, Krulak asked White what he wanted to do with his Marine Corps career. And White, never one to be shy, said he wanted to be a flying sergeant. The flying sergeants were a nearly extinct breed by that point, enlisted men who flew as pilots without holding officer commissions. The program had produced about 480 Marine pilots during World War II, but it had been discontinued in 1948. The last 4 Marine enlisted pilots, all of them veterans of 3 wars, would not retire until February 1973. Krulak told White that they were not making any more of those, but he offered an alternative. He could transfer White to the Army, which had a warrant officer flight program that would take him. White accepted, thinking he could do his time in the Army and eventually transfer back to the Marines as a pilot. It did not work out that way, but the path he took instead led him into some of the most intense helicopter combat of the entire war. Before we follow White into the Army, we need to talk about what was happening to the helicopter war more broadly, because by late 1967 and early 1968, the situation had become critical. The siege of Khe Sanh, which lasted from January to April 1968, was one of the most intense periods of the entire war, and it was the helicopter crews who kept the base alive. Khe Sanh was a Marine combat base in the northwestern corner of South Vietnam, just a few miles from the border with Laos and not far from North Vietnam. The base sat on a plateau surrounded by hills, and in early 1968, the North Vietnamese surrounded it with an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 troops. They dug trenches, positioned artillery and rockets in the hills, and began a siege that some observers compared to the French disaster at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The roads to Khe Sanh were cut. Fixed-wing aircraft could land on the runway, but it was under constant artillery fire, and several planes were destroyed on the ground. Helicopters became the lifeline for the 6,000 Marines and South Vietnamese soldiers defending the base and the surrounding hilltop outposts. The problem was that the North Vietnamese knew this as well as the Americans did, and they positioned anti-aircraft guns to shoot down any helicopter that tried to approach. Flying into Khe Sanh was suicidal by conventional methods. The man who figured out how to change that was Major David L. Althoff, the operations officer and later executive officer of HMM 262. Althoff was a CH-46 pilot of exceptional skill, known to his crews as balls-to-the-wall Althoff for his aggressive flying. He would later be called the finest CH-46 pilot in the Marine Corps, and during the siege of Khe Sanh, he proved it. Althoff developed a tactic that became known as the super gaggle. The name came from helicopter slang, a gaggle being a formation of helicopters, like a gaggle of geese. What Althoff created was a massive, precisely choreographed aerial operation, designed to overwhelm the enemy defenses and get supplies through to the besieged hilltops. A typical super gaggle involved 8 to 16 CH-46 helicopters, each carrying a 3,000-pound external cargo load suspended beneath it. But they did not go in alone. Before the helicopters arrived, A-4 Skyhawk jets would work over the enemy positions with napalm and bombs, They would saturate known anti-aircraft sites with CS tear gas to blind and disable the gunners. They would lay smoke screens along the approach route to hide the helicopters. UH-1E gunship helicopters would fly escort, suppressing any guns that still fired. Then, and only then, the cargo helicopters would make their approach, coming in fast and low, dropping their external loads on the landing zone without ever touching down if possible, and pulling out immediately while the jets and gunships continued to pound the surrounding hills. The super gaggle was dangerous, but it worked. Before the tactic was implemented, helicopters were taking hits at a rate that made resupply nearly impossible. After Althoff and his colleagues refined the technique, the hit rate dropped by half. It was still dangerous, incredibly so, but it was survivable. Marine helicopters flew over 9,000 sorties during the siege, transported more than 10,600 passengers, and delivered over 3,300 tons of supplies. Without them, Khe Sanh would have fallen. Althoff himself flew mission after mission into the worst of it. He was awarded 3 Silver Stars for separate acts of extraordinary heroism, along with 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses and more than 50 air medals. In 1968, he received the Alfred A. Cunningham Award as Marine Aviator of the Year, specifically for developing the super gaggle tactics that saved Khe Sanh. He retired as a colonel and passed away in 2022, remembered as one of the true heroes of the helicopter war. The cost of keeping Khe Sanh alive was terrible. During the 77-day siege, 35 helicopters were destroyed outright, and another 123 were damaged. Crew chiefs, door gunners, and pilots died by the dozens. HMM 262 alone lost 20 crew members in February 1968, a single month of horror. The conditions at the base were apocalyptic, with constant shelling, trenches that reminded veterans of World War I, and rats that swarmed the underground bunkers where men tried to sleep. When helicopters landed to deliver supplies or pick up wounded, they often had only seconds before incoming mortar rounds began falling. Getting wounded men aboard while under fire became a grim routine. The medevac crews performed miracles, but not everyone could be saved, and the men who flew those missions carried the memories for the rest of their lives. While the Marines were fighting to save Khe Sanh, Jim White had completed his transition from the Marine Corps to the Army and had gone through Warrant Officer Flight School. He returned to Vietnam as a helicopter pilot, and he requested duty as far north as possible, right up by the demilitarized zone where he had served as a Marine and knew the terrain. He was assigned to an aviation unit at Dong Ha, just a few miles from North Vietnam, and he found himself flying the small observation helicopters that were among the most dangerous aircraft in the war. The unit had 2 types of scout helicopters. The older one was the OH-23G Raven, a small bubble cockpit helicopter that dated back to the Korean War. It was dangerously underpowered and had a nasty habit of auto-rotating like a rock if the engine failed. The newer one was the OH-6A Cayuse, which the crews universally called the Loach, a corruption of the acronym LOH for Light Observation Helicopter. The Loach was small, fast, and maneuverable, and scout pilots flew it at treetop level or lower, hunting for the enemy, drawing fire to locate hidden positions and calling in strikes. It was an incredibly dangerous job. Of the 1,419 Loaches built, 842 were destroyed in Vietnam, a loss rate approaching 60%. Flying a Loach meant accepting that you would probably be shot down at some point. The only question was whether you would survive it. White flew scouts, and he flew them aggressively. He developed the ability to read the jungle floor from just a few feet above it, tracking enemy movement by subtle signs, fresh footprints in the mud, the moisture pattern left by recent rain, the way the vegetation bent where men had passed. He pushed his little helicopter to its limits, flying so low that the skids brushed the elephant grass, popping up over ridgelines and diving back down before the enemy could react. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and deadly. On one mission, White was crossing a ridgeline in the DMZ when an enemy machine gun crew caught him from behind. They raked his aircraft with fire, blowing out the windshield, destroying the instruments, and hitting the engine. His door gunner was shot and fell out of the aircraft, saved only by the safety harness called a monkey strap that kept him attached to the helicopter. Despite the damage, White managed to fly the crippled Loach back to a friendly position and crash-land it. The next morning, he went back out in another helicopter to find the machine gun position that had shot him down. He found it, but they were waiting for him, and they shot him down again. He crashed about 500 feet from his first wreck. His wingman picked him up, flew him back to base, and White got into a third helicopter and went back out again. He was shot down a third time that same day. When he returned to base after his wingman rescued him for the third time, his commanding officer, Colonel Roscoe Cartwright, was waiting for him. Cartwright was a remarkable figure in his own right, a black Army officer who would become one of the first African-American generals in U.S. military history. He looked at White and said, "Come with me to the club. I can't afford to lose any more helicopters today." Cartwright later arranged for White's transfer to flying AH-1G Cobras, the fearsome attack helicopters that provided fire support for the scouts and transport helicopters. The Cobra was the world's first purpose-built attack helicopter, and it had arrived in Vietnam in August 1967. It was designed from the ground up to be a weapons platform with a narrow fuselage that made it hard to hit, tandem seating for pilot and gunner, and stub wings that carried rockets and other ordnance. A chin turret mounted a minigun or grenade launcher that the gunner controlled. The Cobra could escort transport helicopters, provide close air support for troops on the ground, or hunt enemy positions independently. It was fast, deadly, and the crews who flew them developed an aggressive esprit de corps. White transitioned to Cobras and was eventually assigned to one of the most secret operations of the entire war. It was called MACV-SOG, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observation Group. The innocuous-sounding name was deliberately misleading. SOG was a joint unconventional warfare task force that ran covert operations across the borders of South Vietnam into Laos, Cambodia, and even North Vietnam. These operations were highly classified, and the men who participated signed documents swearing them to secrecy for 25 years. If they were killed or captured outside South Vietnam, the official position was that they were not there. Families of men lost on SOG missions were told their loved ones had been lost at sea, bodies not recovered. SOG was divided into 3 regional commands. Command and Control North, or CCN, was based at Da Nang and operated in northern Laos and sometimes into North Vietnam itself. Command and Control Central, or CCC, was based at Kon Tum and worked southern Laos and northern Cambodia. Command and Control South, or CCS, was based at Ban Mi Thuot and focused on Cambodia. White flew Cobras for CCN, supporting small reconnaissance teams that were inserted deep into enemy territory. The recon teams were tiny, usually just 2 to 4 American Green Berets and 4 to 9 indigenous troops. The indigenous fighters were often montagnards, the mountain-dwelling tribal people of the Central Highlands who had their own reasons for fighting the North Vietnamese, or Nung mercenaries, ethnic Chinese fighters who were considered among the most reliable and effective indigenous forces in the war. The teams carried state names, like Recon Team Idaho or Recon Team Colorado, and their missions were extraordinarily dangerous. They might be inserted by helicopter to observe enemy movement along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or to capture a North Vietnamese officer for interrogation, or to plant sensors along supply routes. The enemy knew they were there and hunted them relentlessly. The helicopter crews who supported SOG developed a special bond with the recon teams. When a team was inserted, the helicopters would orbit nearby, waiting in case they were needed. If the team made contact with the enemy, the Cobras would roll in with rockets and miniguns to suppress the opposition. If the situation became desperate, the team could call a prairie fire emergency, which was essentially a declaration that they were about to be overrun and needed everything available immediately. A prairie fire call went out on the guard frequency, and every aircraft in range was supposed to drop whatever they were doing and respond. Fast movers, fighter bombers, Cobras, transport helicopters, everything converged on the team's position. It was controlled chaos, but it saved lives. The extraction of a team in contact was one of the most dangerous operations helicopter crews could perform. The landing zones were often tiny, sometimes just a patch of elephant grass on a hillside, and the enemy would be shooting from every direction. The transport helicopters, usually UH-1 Hueys or CH-46s from Special Operations Squadrons, would go in, while the Cobras pounded the surrounding jungle. Door gunners fired continuously. Sometimes the recon team members had to be pulled out on ropes or hoists because there was no place to land. Men were wounded, helicopters were hit, and sometimes aircraft went down with everyone aboard. White flew these missions for about 15 months, accumulating an extraordinary amount of combat time. He described it later as the best and worst time of his life. The best because of the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that what they were doing mattered. The worst because of the constant danger, the losses, and the things he saw and did that would stay with him forever. He particularly remembered a Green Beret named Billy Waugh, a legendary figure in special operations who accumulated 9 Purple Hearts over a career that spanned from Korea through Vietnam and beyond. White accidentally wounded Waugh on one mission when shrapnel from a rocket he fired caught the sergeant major in the rear. Waugh, lying on a stretcher having fragments picked out of him, looked up and told White he was going to kill him when he could get up. They remained friends for decades afterward. Then came Operation Lam Son 719, and everything changed. Lam Son 719 was launched in February 1971, and it was the largest helicopter operation of the entire war, as well as its deadliest for helicopter crews. The plan was for South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN, to push west along Route 9 into Laos and cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail at a town called Chepone. This would disrupt the flow of supplies from North Vietnam to communist forces in the south. It was a bold plan, but it had a fatal flaw. The Cooper Church Amendment, passed by Congress in December 1970, prohibited American ground troops and advisors from entering Laos. The ARVN would have to fight without American soldiers alongside them for the first time. American helicopters and air power would provide support, but no American boots would touch Laotian soil. The North Vietnamese knew the attack was coming. They had positioned major forces along Route 9, including multiple anti-aircraft regiments with between 170 and 200 guns. Unlike most of Vietnam, where helicopters operated above the anti-aircraft positions, the terrain in Laos meant the guns were often above the flight paths. Enemy gunners could shoot down at the helicopters, a devastating tactical advantage. The American helicopter force committed to Lam Son 719 was massive, over 750 aircraft drawn from units across Vietnam. On March 6, 1971, the combat assault on Cheponi involved 276 UH-1 helicopters in a single lift, the largest helicopter assault of the war. But the losses were catastrophic. Over the course of the operation, 108 helicopters were destroyed, and another 600 to 618 were damaged. Incredibly, 10% of all helicopter crew casualties for the entire 15-year American involvement in Vietnam occurred during this 2-month operation. The ARVN forces fought hard, but without American advisors on the ground, coordination broke down. Some units performed well, others did not. The withdrawal became chaotic, with desperate South Vietnamese soldiers clinging to helicopter skids as pilots tried to lift off from overrun positions. The images from Lam Son 719 became some of the most iconic and disturbing of the war, a preview of what would happen 4 years later during the fall of Saigon. When Lam Son 719 ended, SOG operations across the borders effectively ceased. The secret war was winding down, and the American withdrawal from Vietnam was accelerating. White continued flying for a few more months with a cavalry unit, then returned to the United States. He tried to stay in the Army as a pilot, but he failed his flight physical. Years of flying in combat had cost him his hearing in one ear. Just like that, his flying career in the military was over. What happened to Jim White after Vietnam is its own story, one that many veterans of his generation would recognize. He could not find aviation work in the civilian world. Vietnam veterans were not welcomed home with parades. They were often met with hostility or indifference. White bounced around for a while, then got a call from a friend about a job with Air America. Air America was the CIA's proprietary airline, which had been operating in Southeast Asia since the 1950s. Officially, it was a civilian passenger and cargo airline. In reality, it flew missions for the agency throughout Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia, supporting covert operations and doing things that military aircraft could not officially do. The airline actively recruited former military pilots, and White signed on. He flew for Air America until the operation wound down, then came back to the United States again, still struggling to find his place. The country had moved on from Vietnam, or was trying to, and men like White found themselves caught between two worlds, no longer at war, but never quite at peace. He eventually found work flying for oil companies in Alaska, and later in Africa during the Rhodesian Bush War. But the restlessness never entirely left him. The friendships he had made in Vietnam remained the most important of his life. He stayed in touch with the men he had flown with, the pilots and crew chiefs and door gunners who had shared those experiences. They understood each other in ways that civilians never could. White said once that he didn't have any civilian friends. Not really. His brothers were the men who had been there, who knew what it meant to fly into fire and trust each other with their lives. The helicopter war in Vietnam produced statistics that are almost impossible to comprehend. The United States and its allies flew more than 36 million helicopter sorties during the war. Nearly 12,000 helicopters served in Vietnam at one time or another. Of these, approximately 5,000 were destroyed, more than 2,000 of them by hostile fire. Over 4,800 helicopter crew members were killed, and thousands more were wounded. The Army alone lost 2,166 pilots. Some of those helicopters crashed in the jungle and were never recovered. Some went down in Laos or Cambodia during missions that were never officially acknowledged. The men aboard them simply disappeared, their families left with nothing but a telegram and a flag. Even today, decades later, the remains of some are still being recovered and identified, brought home at last to be laid to rest with the honor they earned. The machines themselves have mostly vanished. The Hueys, the Cobras, the Loaches, the Sea Knights, most were scrapped or sold off after the war. A few survive as museum pieces, displayed at air shows or military installations where visitors can walk around them and try to imagine what it was like. The Sikorsky H-34 that Jim White crewed in the early days is now a relic of a bygone era. Its big, radial engine and high-mounted cockpit looking almost quaint compared to modern helicopters. The CH-46 Sea Knight served the Marine Corps until 2015, a remarkably long career, but it too has been retired. The OH-6 Loach and the AH-1 Cobra evolved into newer variants that still fly today, their lineage stretching back to those blood-soaked years in Vietnam. The men who flew and crewed those helicopters were ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things. They were farm boys from Kansas and surfers from California, inner-city kids and prep school graduates, volunteers and draftees. Many of them were shockingly young, teenagers and men in their early 20s, learning their trade in combat because there was no other way to learn it. They developed tactics that had never existed before, invented solutions to problems that no one had anticipated, and flew missions that pushed the limits of what helicopters and human beings could endure. They did not all come home, and those who did were changed forever. The helicopter war in Vietnam was not a story of machines. It was a story of people, of the crew chiefs who worked through the night by flashlight to get their birds ready to fly at dawn, of the door gunners who manned their weapons hour after hour in the sweltering heat, of the pilots who made split-second decisions that meant life or death for themselves and everyone aboard. It was a story of medics who flew into hot landing zones to pick up wounded men and held them in their arms as they died on the way to the hospital. It was a story of young officers like Dave Althoff, who figured out that the only way to survive was to innovate, to think differently, to refuse to accept that a problem had no solution. And it was a story of men like Jim White, who came to the military almost by accident, found a purpose and a family, and spent the rest of his life connected to the brothers who had shared those experiences. When Vietnam veterans talk about the war today, many of them speak of it in complicated terms. It was terrible, but it was also the most intense and meaningful experience of their lives. They lost friends, saw things that haunt them still, and came home to a country that did not understand or appreciate what they had done. But they also formed bonds that have lasted decades, friendships forged in fire that nothing can break. They take care of each other, show up at reunions and funerals, and keep alive the memory of those who did not come back. They made a point, in the years after Vietnam, of ensuring that the veterans of later wars would not be treated the way they were. When American troops came home from Iraq and Afghanistan, Vietnam veterans were often there to welcome them, to shake their hands and thank them, to let them know that their sacrifice mattered. It was a gift born of hard experience, a determination that no generation of American warriors should ever again feel abandoned by the nation they served. The helicopter itself became the symbol of the Vietnam War in ways that no other weapon system did. The image of the Huey, its distinctive rotor sound throbbing through the jungle, is inseparable from our collective memory of that conflict. The helicopters brought troops into battle and carried the wounded out. They delivered supplies to remote outposts and inserted special operations teams behind enemy lines. They provided fire support and reconnaissance and medical evacuation. They were everywhere, all the time, the workhorses and war horses of a war that demanded mobility above all else. And the men who flew them paid a terrible price. The casualty rate for helicopter crews was among the highest of any specialty in the American military. Scout pilots in particular faced odds that would give anyone pause. Flying a Loach at treetop level, deliberately drawing enemy fire to locate hidden positions, was almost guaranteed to result in being shot down, eventually. The only question was whether you would be lucky enough to walk away. Many did, many did not. The names of the fallen are inscribed on the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. 58,000 names etched into stone, each one representing a life cut short, a family forever altered, a story that ended too soon. Among them are the helicopter pilots and crew members who gave everything they had. We cannot know all their stories. We cannot hear their voices or see their faces, except in faded photographs. But we can remember that they were real people, that they laughed and worried and wrote letters home, that they loved and were loved in return. We can remember that when their country called, they answered, and that many of them never came back. The legacy of the helicopter war extends far beyond Vietnam. The tactics developed in those jungles and rice paddies became the foundation of modern air-mobile warfare. The super gaggle that Dave Althoff pioneered at Khe Sanh evolved into the sophisticated helicopter operations that American forces conduct today. The scout and attack team concept, with Loaches and Cobras working together, became the model for aerial reconnaissance and fire support that has been refined over generations. The medical evacuation procedures that saved thousands of lives in Vietnam were standardized and improved, so that today a wounded soldier can be in an operating room within an hour of being hit. None of that came free. It was paid for in blood by the men who figured it out the hard way, who crashed and burned and died so that those who came after them would have a better chance. They were the first generation of helicopter warriors, and they learned their trade in the hardest school imaginable. Every improvement in helicopter design, every new tactic, every refinement in doctrine stands on the foundation they built. They would probably not want to be called heroes. Most veterans are uncomfortable with that word, feeling that the real heroes were the ones who did not make it back. But they were heroes nonetheless. Ordinary men who did extraordinary things because the situation demanded it and because their brothers depended on them. They flew into places where no sane person would go, faced dangers that would make most people freeze, and kept flying day after day until their tours were over or their luck ran out. That is heroism, whether they want to call it that or not. Jim White survived the war and lived to see old age, though he carried the memories with him always. He stayed connected to the men he had served with, making pilgrimages to reunions where old warriors gathered to remember their youth and their lost friends. He spoke about his experiences occasionally, sharing his story so that people would know what had happened and what it meant. He was not bitter, though he had reason to be. He had given years of his life to a war that many Americans wanted to forget, and he had come home to find that his sacrifices were not appreciated. But he found meaning in the service itself, in the camaraderie and the sense of purpose, in the knowledge that he had done something that mattered, even if the war's outcome did not turn out the way he had hoped. That is perhaps the final lesson of the helicopter war in Vietnam. The men who fought it did not get to choose the politics or the strategy. They did not get to decide whether the war was worth fighting or how it would end. All they could do was their duty, as they understood it, to the best of their ability. They took care of each other. They flew the missions they were assigned. They brought out the wounded and tried to leave no one behind. When the war was over and the last helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof in Saigon, they came home and tried to build lives in a country that had moved on without them. Some succeeded, some struggled. All of them were changed. Today, the men of the helicopter war are in their 70s and 80s, those who are still with us. Their numbers diminish every year as time takes its inevitable toll. Soon, there will be no one left who flew a Huey into a hot LZ, no one who crewed a CH-46 during the siege of Khe Sanh, no one who piloted a Loach at treetop level through the jungles of Vietnam. Their stories will live on only in books and documentaries and the memories of those who knew them. This has been another story from Great American Classics. Before we finish, it's worth taking a moment to remember the men who flew those helicopters, who crewed them, who fixed them through long nights so they could fly again at dawn. They were young, most of them, younger than we can easily imagine facing such dangers. They volunteered for one of the most hazardous duties in the military, knowing the risks and accepting them because the job needed to be done. More than 4,000 of them never came home. Their names are on the wall, and their memory lives in the hearts of the brothers who survived. The helicopter war in Vietnam was brutal and costly, and often forgotten in the larger debates about the conflict. But the men who fought it deserve to be remembered for their courage and their sacrifice and their devotion to each other. They gave so much, and many of them gave everything, for a country that did not always appreciate what they had done. Their sacrifice is not something we should ever forget, and their story still matters today. Thank you for listening.